Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the AAHOA Educational Experience. This week, joining me, we'll start with Raj Goyal, a former State House of Representative member from the state of Kansas and a big supporter, longtime supporter of AAHOA. Raj, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
And Lori Kalani, Senior Counsel with Orick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe.
Pleasure.
And Lori, thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
We're going to start today's show and really focus on the issue of lobbying. This is something that I think a lot of people, they hear on the news. Unfortunately, they hear it in the terms sometimes of the Jack Abramoffs of the world, which I think really is unfortunate, because I know when I speak to people and I speak about lobbying, I usually tell a group, I say, everybody in here is a lobbyist. In one way or another, you are lobbying somebody for something, because lobbying is just someone talking about their self-interest in a certain way, but I'm not a lobbyist, so I would like to talk to somebody who has done this before.
Sure.
Lori, for our viewers, what is a lobbyist in its just most basic terms?
I just like to think of a lobbyist as an advocate for a particular position or a particular, basically a particular position, somebody who's educated and is in a role to advocate on behalf of that position and educate a lawmaker on the other side as to what the implications of that law would be. When I was in law school, people used to say to me, wow, Laura, you'd make a great lobbyist. And I used to say, really? I was in school in the DC area. Some
Right.
people said to me, they never said that to me over in Vermont. And I think it's a very important role that is part of the legislative process, because I know I have not been a legislator, but I have many friends who have, and I know that as you are elected to the legislature, you have so many roles to play and so much information that you're expected to know when you're confronted with these bills, and there would be no human out there who would know all of the information and be able to understand all sides of an issue. And so lobbyists play a very important advocate role in this process in educating legislators on one side. Obviously, you typically have lobbyists advocating on both sides or many sides, but it's a very important role in educating the legislature on what the implications of a particular position are. And
Raj, it's interesting because I'm sure when you were in office and you would have constituents and they don't really understand the role of a lobbyist, and sometimes it has a negative connotation. And I'll often say, well, there are lobbyists for banks, there are lobbyists for big business, but there's also lobbyists for the American Cancer Society.
Sure.
There's lobbyists for a children's hospital. There's lobbyists for a clean environment. I mean, so any interest that you have that comes before a lawmaking body, there's going to be somebody who's willing to advocate for that position, and that's really what it comes down to.
Well, you're absolutely right. There's lobbyists of all stripes, and people probably have one image of a lobbyist in their mind. I think that people have that image, though, for good reason, because the question is, how much influence do lobbyists have? And I think that from my experience, I would say that the free flow of information, as Lori mentioned, is absolutely essential, that we need more information, and it goes along with the transparency of the process, that we need more parties involved to debate the ideas and proposals that are in the legislative process. That being said, I think that people do have a legitimate concern about the role of how much lobbyists have influence in the process. In the ideal sense, when we just get information from lobbying and third parties, that's a good thing, because there needs to be more information in the process. Of course, what we need to make sure is that public policy is being made for good reasons and based on the validity of the idea, and not necessarily from the endorsements or not of certain lobbyists.
It highlights something, and this is something that I know that when I speak to groups about lobbying, that I tell everyone is absolutely critical. And a lobbyist is only as good as their word. And if somebody gives you something that is false information, misleading information, or they lie to you, you have no reason to trust them anymore, and you don't need to necessarily rely on them. So from the interactions I've had, 99.9% of the people are going to tell you the truth, because there really is no alternative.
And you want to be a credible resource. Your credibility is your career as a lobbyist, and nobody's going to want to speak to you and share ideas with you if you don't sort of give them the straight picture. And so that is absolute key. And it's also relationships and credibility and trustworthiness and reacting quickly. I know that the legislative process, as slow as it moves in Washington, D.C., when something has to happen and there's a committee hearing, legislators need the information now. And so it's about being responsive and giving them correct information, but also timely, and getting back to them and giving them the answers that they're looking for.
I'll give you a perfect example. I remember working on legislation dealing with taxes on automobiles. And now I could have gone to the Department of Revenue and asked them a question, say, all right, in such and such year, how much tax was collected on the sale of used cars? And 3 weeks later, I might get my answer.
Right.
Or I can go to the Georgia Automobile Dealer
That's
Association.
fast.
Yeah, that's fast. Or I could go to the Georgia Automobile Dealer Association, and they'll have it to me by the end of the day. And that's where I think it plays an important role.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that that I did when I was in the legislature, and I'm sure you as well, is to think about how laws and proposed bills affect real people. And I think that's a valuable role. You know, if you're writing a law about automobiles, car dealers are important small business people in the community, and they support a lot of things in localities and communities, and they're going to know how it affects, how that law is actually going to affect the day-to-day business and commerce and interactions they have with their customers. And it's not a good thing for legislators, in my view, to sit back in a small room and think, well, this is the way I think the world works, and we're going to pass this bill, and we're going to debate it in this way. It's very important to make sure there's robust debate and there's information on all sides. And so I think that, again, the more people are involved in the process, and I think the concern that people have is that when there are issues that maybe deserve to have lobbyists that don't. And so, you know, sometimes we do need to make sure that there's a balance between all the interests being represented with lobbying efforts. But I think the more people we get involved, the better.
And to that point, Lori, what do you perceive as the proper role of lobbying in the legislative process, whether it be in Washington, D.C. or some state capital somewhere? What is the proper role?
I think, as we've been saying, as a resource of information and a contact for legislators to be able to reach out to for information as they're going through this process. Certainly, friendships are built. It's like with any other industry. I've been doing this a long time. I work with lobbyists in all 50 states, and I've been a federal lobbyist, and I'm registered as a state lobbyist. And over time, people stay in the legislature for a long time, and you strike up a friendship, and there's a sort of camaraderie, but at the end of the day, the role is really to provide the information, and like you said, Raj, to provide the debate and to be a resource as we go through this process.
What's your impression on the proper role of lobbying in the legislative process?
Well, I think, as Lori mentioned, the best role is to provide information and also to make sure that there's disclosure of whose interest lobbyists are representing. And so that's why it's important that there are lobbying disclosure rules and registrations and so on, so that things are in the open and that people know why a certain person is advocating a certain position. And so I think again, I sound like a broken record here, but the more transparency and the more openness there is in the process, I think the public and our constituents will feel more confidence in what's happening in the system, because that image that's out there of a closed process where paid interests are wielding outsized influence is a real perception. And so that's why the legislative process should do everything it can to make sure that it doesn't meet that perception, but actually in reality works in an open way for good public policy.
And to put a finer point on it, I think another role for lobbyists is to educate their own clients on the process. So many times, even businesses that one would assume, which is incorrect, that a business or an industry understands the process. Today, companies are nationwide, and they don't necessarily understand the process in each state. So I think it's incumbent upon the lobbyist to educate their client and make sure that their client understands the timeline and set the expectation, and let their client, whether it's a business or if it's the Cancer Association or a school or a hospital, give them the right expectations so they can sort of run their business or their organization based on the likely outcome or not of a particular piece of legislation.
Well, we need to take a quick time out. We are talking about lobbying and lobbyists and how it fits into the whole model of governing our states and our nation. And we'll take a time out and be back right after this. And welcome back to the AAHOA Educational Experience. I'm Chip Rogers, and with me this week is former state representative from Kansas, Raj Goyal, and Lori Kalani, who is a senior counsel at Orick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. And today we're talking about lobbying and lobbyists and the influence it has on the entire legislative process. And Lori, I know you've, as a lobbyist, you don't pick teams.
Right.
In America, we all pick teams. You're either Democrat or you're Republican, and some people claim to be independent, but I believe they're actually lean one way or the other, depending on which way the wind blows. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But as a lobbyist, you can't pick a team. I mean, you really have to approach both sides of this political equation with sometimes a different approach, but with the same goal in mind, and that is, of course, accomplishing what you'd like to accomplish. But is there a different way of lobbying someone who is in the left side of the Democratic camp or the right side of the Republican camp? I mean, do you handle that differently when you walk in that door? I mean, you know who you're talking to, and your message is probably different depending on who it is.
Right, sure. I think that every situation is going to be different, but just generally speaking, if I'm going to be advocating a position and speaking to Democrats, I'm going to think more about what the party issues are and what are the important issues to them. So I would think more about social issues, where if I were talking to Republicans, and again, there's variations with different people, and part of the art of lobbying is really knowing who you're going in and talking to, and understanding where their public record's been and where they've come out on issues. But speaking to somebody who is Republican, I would be talking more about, I would focus more on the business issues of things, and or no taxes, again, depending on the client and the issue. But I certainly would tailor my remarks while still staying within the range of what I'm trying to do based on the party that I'm speaking to.
And I would suspect that talking to a Democrat from Louisiana and talking to perhaps a Republican from Massachusetts may not be that far apart.
Exactly right. Right.
So sometimes even
Right.
within the context of the parties, you have people who are labeled moderate Republicans or blue dog Democrats.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so, I mean, there's a lot of different shades here.
And it really depends on the issue. Sometimes, I mean, a very divided issue is going to be more divided than an issue that people sort of come together on, and whether you're a Democrat and you're leaning far left or you're a Republican, you're going to tend to come together. It just really depends on the issue.
And how do you handle, and I got some questions for you too in
Yeah,
a second.
that's all right. That's all right.
How do you handle, and I guess this is one of the real big challenges, knowing what an individual member's issues are or background is? I mean, sometimes I would suspect you come in with you're going to lobby on a certain issue, discuss a certain issue, but this individual member may have had some sort of life experience that impacts actually what you're going to say to them.
Oh, absolutely, and that's homework, right? It's being prepared, and it's doing your job. Look, I could be meeting with legislators when I don't really have an issue, and it's just to talk about something more general and to get to know them as a person, and history, and looking at their voting record, and reading media clips. We talked earlier about the media. It's sort of 24-hour politics. It's not tough to get to know a person today when you can go on their Facebook page and read about them. And so it's really homework and knowing who your audience is.
And Raj, there's really different types of lobbying. There's the individual who comes to the Capitol, oftentimes not a registered lobbyist, they're just an individual, citizen that wants to talk to you about something. You have association lobbying where people represent a large group of people, and then you have issue lobbying where you have people who have all kind of coalesced around a single issue, and may appoint someone to come lobby on their behalf. So there's really all different worlds out there, and why people are coming to see you can vary from what they're trying to represent.
Well, absolutely, and that's why it again comes back to the judgment of the legislator, because in this day and age, again, getting back to the 24/7 media, you get information bombarded at you. You're just deluged with information, and you can be walking into the chamber, and someone will hand you a flyer, and it could be from somebody who's just made it on their home computer and printed it up, or it could be a fancy glossy thing from a registered paid lobbyist, and so it really just comes back to the judgment of the legislator and what that particular legislative proposal, where it sits in the process at the time. And one of the things we were chatting about is that I had a bill. Many people know that Kansas is home to Fred Phelps and the Westboro Church, who are the disgusting and hateful people who picket the funerals of
They
our.
do not do Kansas well.
No, they do not, and it's a real sore spot for Kansas, as you can imagine. So I authored a bill to restrict where they could picket at funerals, and many states have done had done this, the federal government had done it. And so I actually went out and looked up who the VFW and American Legion lobbyists were and who represented them in the Capitol, to sit down with them and say, look, I'm working on this. What do you think? Who are the other lawmakers you've worked with in the past? Because I was a new legislator at the time, and sort of mapped out where the issues stood with the lobbyists of those veterans organizations, and then in fact involved the Attorney General, because it was a very legal matter, and we were talking before about how the courts were involved, and so that was a legislative issue that seemed very simple. Thankfully there's no one who's with Fred Phelps. Everybody wants to vote for that bill, but getting it through the process and getting all the people at the table and getting that language just right took a lot of information, and so that's why it was helpful in a sense to have those the Veterans Affairs and the Veteran Service organizations have their lobbyists in the Capitol to make sure I could work with them to get the best bill we could.
And I think you point out something that probably most people don't recognize, but from a legislator standpoint, it happens all the time. I believe most people think that legislators show up for work and lobbyists are lined up out the door to come see them, and while that occasionally happens, there's also many times where a legislator says, I want to accomplish this. I want to pass this law. I want to pass a law closing down Fred Phelps. Who can I go to? What lobbyists can I go to help spread my word the other way?
Absolutely.
And so that, and that's where the associations, AAHOA is a perfect example.
Absolutely.
If you're a legislator and you want to do something that you think would potentially, it could help a lot of people, but one group it could help would be the hotel industry. You would go to AAHOA and say, look, I'm doing this, it's going to help the hotel industry. Can you help me?
Yeah, right. And absolutely. And
garner support for my bill.
Right. Or as we were talking about before, get information. You gave the automobile example. So, here's a legislative issue affecting fair franchising, an issue of great concern to AAHOA members, or property taxes. And so sitting down with AAHOA and saying, hey, how does this affect you? Again, how does this affect the real life of constituents and the economy in our state?
And speak to that for just a moment, Lori, association lobbying, because we think of individual lobbying, we think of bankers and whomever coming in, but then you have associations. You may have as you said, the franchisee association. AAHOA, of course, is an association. There's thousands of associations, and typically, I guess they'll find somebody to come advocate on their behalf, and that's really one person speaking for thousands.
Absolutely. It's one person speaking for thousands, and oftentimes the associations are very sophisticated in the way that they can work with their lobbyists and come in as a resource with the lobbyists. So the lobbyist can make the meetings happen and has the relationship, but the experts in that industry come from the association, and they can cover, for instance, you talk about hotels, small hotels, larger hotels, medium-sized hotels, whatever the issue is, that the association brings with it a lot of good information to assist the legislators with.
And it's important because I can't meet with 10,000 members,
Right.
but I can meet with one person speaking for the 10,000.
Right.
That makes a big difference.
Right.
Absolutely. One example I might give is that we wanted to do some legislation about identity theft, and so I work with the AARP, and so the AARP has a good reputation and a brand that seniors recognize, and so I said, analyze this, let's work together, and let's figure out a good legislative proposal. And so they're a great example, or a classic example, of an association lobbyist that they actually they advocate in state capitals and in Washington, of course, but they also serve their members as a membership organization.
And when you go to an AARP and they like your legislation, they put it in their newsletter, that helps.
Oh, yeah. Because that helps the grassroots effort, right?
That's right. And actually, we got that law passed. That actually also helped in implementing the law, because it was that law actually provided relief for seniors, and it would only work if seniors took advantage of it.
Right. Well, we are out of time, but this has been very informative, and I hope our viewers liked it. Lori Kalani, Senior Counsel with Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, and of course Raj Goyal, former member of the Kansas House of Representatives. I'm Chip Rogers for AAHOA. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, you can email me, chip@ahoa.com. That's chip@ahoa.com. We'll see you again next week.